Jack Miller stared at the holographic invitation floating above his workbench, his coffee forgotten in his hand. The blue light cast strange shadows across his small, cluttered workshop on the outskirts of New Denver. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, reaching out to touch the spinning emblem of the Galactic Engineering Summit. The hologram rippled but remained solid, definitely authentic. 3 years had passed since Earth had joined the Galactic Alliance, and humans were still treated like children who had accidentally wandered into the adults' room. The alien races had technologies humans could barely understand, and they made sure everyone knew it. Jack set down his coffee and ran a hand through his messy brown hair. His designs had won him fame on Earth, but only amused smirks from the few alien engineers who had bothered to look at them. They called his ideas quaint and charmingly primitive. One Terrian engineer had actually patted him on the head. The invitation rotated slowly, displaying the details. The summit would take place on Vox, a planet famous for its perfect gravity and atmosphere, ideal for testing new spacecraft. Every important engineer in the galaxy would be there. His eyes drifted to the tarp-covered shape that took up most of his workshop. 6 years of work, countless failed attempts, and one breakthrough after another had led to what lay beneath that tarp. The Phoenix, he called it. Not because it rose from ashes, but because Earth birds had inspired its unusual design. The aliens would laugh. They always laughed. Their ships were massive, complicated things with artificial gravity and faster-than-light drives that bent the rules of physics. His communicator buzzed. It was Tom, his old college roommate who now worked for Earth's space agency. "Jack, did you get it? The invitation?" "Yeah," Jack answered, still staring at the hologram. "Probably just invited me as the token human. Good for a few laughs." "Don't be like that," Tom said. "This is huge. No human engineer has ever been invited before. They're finally noticing us." "Noticing us like we're ants building a little dirt hill," Jack replied. "So what? Show them what ants can do." Jack walked over to his ship and pulled back the tarp. The Phoenix didn't look like any spacecraft humans or aliens had built before. Its hull curved in places where conventional wisdom said it should be straight. Its engine configuration broke half a dozen established rules, but in Jack's simulations, it worked perfectly. "Maybe I will," he said finally. 3 weeks later, Jack stood in the enormous docking bay of the transport ship headed for Vox. All around him, alien engineers from 24 worlds chatted and compared notes. A group of tall, blue-skinned Terrians looked his way and whispered something that made them all laugh. An overhead announcement declared boarding would begin soon. Jack tightened his grip on his bag of tools and designs. His real contribution, the Phoenix, was following on an automated cargo ship, scheduled to arrive a day after him. "You the human engineer?" a deep voice asked from behind. Jack turned to find himself facing a Terrian with elaborate silver markings on his blue skin, a sign of high rank. "Jack Miller," he said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. The Terrian looked at Jack's hand like it might bite him. "Rek," he said without taking it. "Chief Engineer of the Terrian Fleet. I was curious what a human might bring to our summit. Your species has only just learned to lead your own solar system, yes?" "We're quick learners," Jack replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you are," Rex said with a tone that suggested the opposite. "I look forward to seeing your contribution." As the Terrian walked away laughing with his colleagues, Jack took a deep breath. The real test wasn't the summit or even the ship he'd built. It was standing his ground among those who had mastered the stars long before humans had invented the wheel. The boarding call came, and Jack stepped forward. Whatever waited on Vox, he would face it. For himself and for Earth. The planet Vox sparkled like a jewel as the transport ship began its descent. Jack pressed his face against the viewport, taking in the magnificent spires of the Galactic Engineering Summit Center. The buildings twisted upward in impossible shapes, defying gravity in ways human architecture never could. "First time seeing Vox?" asked a soft voice. Jack turned to find a small alien with pale green skin and large eyes watching him. She was about half his height, with 4 slender arms and a friendly smile. "That obvious, huh?" Jack smiled back. "I'm Lori," she said, "Mendari engineer, specializing in energy systems." Jack Miller, human engineer, specializing in getting laughed at, apparently. Lori tilted her head. "The Terrians have been talking about you. They find humans amusing." "Yeah, I noticed," Jack said, glancing at a group of blue-skinned Terrians who pointed at him and snickered. After landing, Jack followed the crowd to the enormous main hall where the opening ceremony would take place. Thousands of engineers from across the galaxy gathered under a dome that seemed to be made of flowing liquid metal. Jack found a seat near the back, feeling very small and very human. A tall Terrian walked onto the central platform. Even from a distance, Jack recognized Rek by the silver markings on his skin. The alien's voice boomed through the hall. "Welcome to the 243rd Galactic Engineering Summit. This year we have representatives from 87 worlds, including," he paused for effect, "our newest galactic neighbors, the humans." All eyes turned to Jack. He tried to look confident. "Let us hope they learn something useful to take back to their little planet," Rek continued, generating waves of laughter. After the ceremony, Jack checked his assigned workspace on his datapad. The map led him down several corridors, each one smaller than the last, until he reached a tiny room far from the main exhibition hall. It was barely larger than a closet, with a simple desk and outdated equipment. Jack's shoulders slumped. This was the space given to the token human, out of sight and out of mind. His communicator chimed with a message from the spaceport. The Phoenix had arrived and was being moved to holding Bay 94. At least he would have his ship, even if no one wanted to see it. Later that day, Jack attended a technical session about advanced propulsion systems. He sat quietly until the speaker, another Terrian, made a claim about energy efficiency that directly contradicted Jack's research. Jack raised his hand. "Excuse me, but I've found that reversing the polarity actually increases efficiency by nearly 40%. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. Soon, the entire room was laughing. "Perhaps on your primitive human vessels," the speaker said with a smirk. "But real starships require real engineering, not backyard tinkering." Jack felt his face burn. He wanted to argue, but knew it would only make things worse. As the session ended, he gathered his notes and headed for the exit. "Your idea was interesting," said a voice behind him. It was Lori, the Mendari engineer. "Thanks, but apparently I don't know what I'm talking about," Jack replied bitterly. "They always reject new ideas," Lori said quietly, "especially from newcomers. The Terrians were laughed at too, when they first joined the Alliance." "How long ago was that?" "About 4,000 years ago," Lori admitted with a small smile. Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Great, so I only need to wait 4 millennia for them to take me seriously." "Or you could show them something they can't ignore," Lori suggested. Jack thought about the Phoenix waiting in Bay 94. "Maybe I will." As they walked, a message flashed across all datapads in the summit. Rek was announcing a special challenge. Design a ship that could navigate the infamous Krell Nebula, known for its unpredictable energy storms. No existing ship had ever successfully crossed it. Jack stopped walking. A slow smile spread across his face. "What?" Lori asked, noticing his expression. "I need to get to Bay 94, Jack said. Now, Bay 94 was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the spaceport. Jack rushed through the doorway with Lori hurrying behind him on her shorter legs. Inside, the Phoenix sat under bright lights, looking strangely small compared to the massive alien ships in the main bays. "This is your ship?" Lori asked, her large eyes growing even wider. The Phoenix didn't look like other spacecraft. Its hull had smooth curves instead of hard angles. Its engines were arranged in a pattern that made no sense by conventional standards. And it was small, barely 30 feet long. "I know it's not much to look at," Jack said, placing his hand on the hull. "But she's got a few tricks up her sleeve." Lori walked around the ship, studying it with professional interest. "These curves, they're all based on math, aren't they?" Jack nodded. "Patterns I found in nature back on Earth. Birds, fish, even the way water flows around rocks." He tapped on his datapad, and a hologram appeared showing the detailed schematics. Lori gasped. "Your power configuration. I've never seen anything like it." "That's because everyone else keeps thinking bigger and more complex is better," Jack explained. I went the opposite way. Their conversation was interrupted by loud voices approaching. Jack quickly shut off his hologram as Rek entered with 5 other Terrian engineers. "Ah, there's our human friend," Rek said with false warmth. "We were curious about what Earth technology looks like." His eyes fell on the Phoenix, and his mouth curled into a smile. "This is it. This tiny thing is your contribution to the summit." The other Terrians laughed. One of them walked up and knocked on the hull. "What's it made of?" "Primitive metals. Not even proper quantum-aligned materials." Jack bit his tongue. The Phoenix's hull was made of a composite he'd developed himself, but explaining would only invite more ridicule. "I heard you're entering the Krell Nebula Challenge," Rex said, still circling the ship. "Bold move for someone whose species has barely left their own solar system." "The nebula doesn't care how advanced your civilization is," Jack replied evenly. Rex's smile disappeared. "The nebula will tear this toy apart. The energy storms would destroy even our most advanced ships. What chance does human technology have?" "Maybe we'll find out," Jack said. After the Terrians left, laughing among themselves, Lori turned to Jack. "Are you really going to enter the challenge?" "I am," Jack said. "And I don't plan to design a new ship. I'm entering with the Phoenix." Lori's mouth fell open. "But it wasn't built for the nebula. You'd need special shielding, adaptive navigation systems, energy dampeners, or a completely different approach," Jack interrupted, pulling up detailed scans of the Krell Nebula on his datapad. "Look at the energy pattern here. It's chaotic, yes, but there's a rhythm to it, like a river with rapids. And you don't fight a river, you flow with it." Jack's fingers danced across the screen, making calculations. "If I adjust the Phoenix's systems to work with the energy patterns instead of fighting them." Lori leaned in, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. "That's actually brilliant, but your ship would need to be incredibly responsive to make those kinds of adjustments in real time. Which is exactly why I built her small and nimble instead of big and powerful," Jack said with a grin. "I need to make some modifications, though. Would you be willing to help me?" Lori hesitated. "Working with you might not be good for my reputation. The Terrians control a lot of funding for Mendari projects." "I understand," Jack said, disappointment clear in his voice. Lori looked at the Phoenix again, then back at Jack. "But maybe it's time someone challenged their way of thinking." She extended one of her 4 hands. "I'll help." As they worked through the night, engineers from other species occasionally wandered by, drawn by curiosity. Most laughed and left, but a few stayed to watch. One of them, a reptilian engineer named Dex, actually offered suggestions. By morning, Jack stood back and looked at his modified ship. It wasn't fancy or imposing like the Terrian vessels, but it was ready. "The challenge starts tomorrow," he said to Lori and the small group that had gathered. "Let's see what the Phoenix can really do." The day before the challenge, Jack was woken by an alarm blaring from his communicator. He bolted upright in the small room he'd been given at the Summit housing complex. The message on his screen made his blood run cold. "Security breach in Bay 94. Jack sprinted through the corridors, pushing past aliens of all shapes and sizes. When he reached Bay 94, he found the door open and Lori standing inside, her 4 hands pressed over her mouth in shock. The Phoenix had been tampered with. Panels were open, components disconnected, and a puddle of strange, glowing liquid was spreading under the main engine housing. Someone did this an hour ago, Lori said, her voice shaking. The bay cameras were disabled. Jack knelt by his ship, assessing the damage. His heart sank. Key components were missing or damaged. The navigation system was completely fried, and the strange liquid was eating through the floor plating like acid. "This is Terrian technology," said Dex, the reptilian engineer who had joined them the day before. He carefully collected a sample of the liquid in a containment field. Military grade, not something a regular engineer would have access to. Jack's fists clenched. "Wreck. We can't prove it," Lori warned. "And even if we could, the Terrians practically run the summit. Accusing their chief engineer would only make things worse for you." Jack stared at his damaged ship. The challenge was in less than 24 hours. "I need parts," he said. "Can either of you help me?" Dex nodded. "I have connections in the maintenance division. Not the best quality, but better than nothing. And I can reconfigure some Mendari components to work with your systems," Lori added. "They'll be more efficient, actually." Word spread among the small group of alien engineers who had taken an interest in Jack's project. By midday, a dozen different species were working in Bay 94, bringing parts, offering suggestions, and helping with repairs. A tall jellyfish-like being floated over Jack as he rewired the navigation system. "Your approach is unusual," it said in a bubbling voice. "On my world, we work with currents, not against them. Perhaps a similar principle applies to energy storms." Jack looked up, surprised by the insight. "Exactly. That's the whole point of the Phoenix's design." As they worked, more curious engineers arrived. Most came to laugh, but some stayed to help when they saw what Jack was trying to do. His small, empty bay became crowded with aliens of all descriptions, passing tools and debating theory. Late in the afternoon, a shadow fell across the entrance. Rex stood there with 2 Terrian guards. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his voice cold. "Just some last-minute improvements," Jack replied, not looking up from his work. Rex's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the mixed group of aliens helping the human. "The challenge rules state that designs must be the work of a single engineer or engineering team from one world. I'm still the designer," Jack said. "These are just my friends, helping me fix some unexpected damage." Rex's face darkened at the implication. "Your primitive ship won't survive the nebula, human. I don't know why you're even bothering." "Maybe I like the challenge," Jack replied. After Rex left, the group worked even harder. By nightfall, the Phoenix was not only repaired but improved in ways Jack hadn't imagined possible. The navigation system now incorporated principles from 6 different worlds. The engine housing was reinforced with a crystalline material a silicon-based engineer had contributed. As the last of the helpers left, promising to watch the challenge the next day, Lori stayed behind with Jack. "Why did you really enter this challenge?" she asked. "You must have known how the others would react." Jack ran his hand over the Phoenix's smooth hull. "Back on Earth, we have a saying. The best way to predict the future is to create it. I'm tired of being told what humans can and can't do by people who've never given us a chance." Lori nodded slowly. "Tomorrow will be interesting." Jack smiled. "Oh, I'm counting on it." That night, as he made final checks on his ship, Jack noticed something strange. The parts and help from different aliens had actually made the Phoenix better than his original design. By forcing him to adapt and incorporate new ideas, the sabotage had inadvertently improved his chances. Sometimes, he thought, the universe had a funny way of working things out. The day of the challenge arrived with a buzz of excitement throughout the summit. Engineers from all corners of the galaxy gathered in the massive observation dome overlooking the test flight area. The transparent ceiling offered a perfect view of the stars above and the edge of the Krell Nebula in the distance, a swirling mass of purple and blue energy storms. Jack stood beside the Phoenix in the launching bay, running through his final checklist. Around him, other engineers prepared their ships. Massive vessels with complicated technology and imposing weapon systems. The Terrian entry, piloted by Rek himself, was nearly 10 times the size of the Phoenix, gleaming with polished blue metal and bristling with energy shields. "Quite the collection of ships," Lori said, joining Jack with Dex at her side. "They look like military vessels more than research craft." "That's how they think," Jack replied. "Overwhelm the problem with power and technology. Brute force." A voice came over the announcement system. "All challenge participants, prepare for launch sequence. Observers, please move to the dome." Lori gave Jack a quick hug with all 4 arms. "Good luck." "Don't die, human," Dex added, which Jack assumed was the reptilian version of good wishes. As his friends left for the observation dome, Jack climbed into the Phoenix. The cockpit was small but comfortable, designed to his exact specifications. He ran his hands over the controls, feeling the moment of calm before the storm. The launch bay doors opened one by one, releasing ships into the test flight area. The Phoenix was scheduled last, a not-so-subtle message about what the organizers thought of its chances. Jack watched through the viewport as the massive alien vessels performed their pre-flight maneuvers, showing off advanced technology and weaponry. The crowd in the dome cheered and gasped at each display. Finally, it was Jack's turn. The voice came over his communication system. "Bay 94, you are cleared for launch. Good luck, human." The Phoenix rose silently from its bay, its engines barely making a sound compared to the roaring behemoths that had launched before it. As Jack guided his ship into the test area, laughter echoed through the open communication channel. "Is that it? So tiny. Did he build that in his garage?" Jack ignored the comments and focused on his controls. The Phoenix might be small, but it moved with a grace and precision that the larger ships couldn't match. He performed a series of quick maneuvers, darting between the other vessels with ease. In the observation dome, the crowd fell silent. The challenge director's voice boomed across all channels. "Engineers, prepare for the nebula approach. As a reminder, the goal is to penetrate as deeply as possible into the Krell Nebula and return with sensor data. No ship has ever successfully crossed the nebula completely." The fleet of ships turned toward the glowing cloud. Jack took up position behind them, watching carefully. This was the moment of truth. The first ships to enter the nebula were immediately buffeted by energy storms. Their shields flared brightly as they fought against the chaotic forces. 2 smaller vessels quickly retreated, systems failing. The others pressed forward, their massive engines struggling against the nebula's resistance. Rek's ship led the way, its powerful shields glowing blue against the purple storm. Over the communication channel, his voice was confident. "This is how you handle a nebula, human. Watch and learn." Jack waited, observing the energy patterns. The other engineers were fighting directly against the storm, pushing through with brute force. But Jack saw something they didn't: rhythms in the chaos, currents in the storm. When half the remaining ships had been forced to turn back, Jack guided the Phoenix toward the nebula. Instead of charging straight in, he approached at an angle, riding the edge of an energy wave like a surfer. "What is he doing?" someone asked over the channel. "Is he swimming through it?" another voice wondered. In the observation dome, the crowd pressed against the glass. Lori and Dex exchanged knowing smiles. The Phoenix slipped into the nebula not by fighting it, but by becoming part of it. Jack's hands moved quickly over the controls, adjusting power and direction to match the flow of energy around him. Where other ships battered against the storm, the Phoenix danced with it. And then it was gone, vanished deeper into the nebula than any ship had ever ventured before. In the silence that followed, Rek's voice came over the channel, tight with anger. "Impossible." Inside the nebula, the Phoenix was surrounded by swirling energy of every color. Lightning-like discharges crackled past the viewport. The ship's sensors recorded everything, gathering more data about the Krell Nebula than anyone had ever collected before. Jack felt the energy patterns through his controls. The ship trembled and swayed, but it never fought against the currents. When a surge came, he rode it. When a vortex formed, he spiraled around it rather than through it. The Phoenix was designed to bend, not break. His navigation screen showed he was now deeper into the nebula than any previous expedition. The energy grew more intense, the patterns more complex. Jack's hands moved constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep the ship in harmony with the storm. "Come in, Phoenix. This is control. Do you copy?" The voice in his communication system was barely audible through the static. "I copy, Control. Still alive in here." Jack couldn't help smiling. "Your signal is weak but stable. You've gone farther than any ship in recorded history. The challenge parameters have been met. You may return now." Jack checked his readings. He was halfway through the nebula. No one had ever seen what lay on the other side. The temptation was too great. "I'm going to continue a bit further," he replied. The answer came back broken by static. "Not advised. Dangerous. Return." Jack switched off the communication system. The Phoenix continued deeper, dancing through increasingly violent energy storms. His ship's systems were holding, but he could feel the strain. Warning lights flickered on his console. Then, suddenly, everything changed. The violent energy patterns gave way to an eerie calm. Jack had reached the eye of the storm, the center of the nebula. Through his viewport, he saw something no one else had ever witnessed, a perfect sphere of swirling energy, like a miniature star being born. His sensors went wild, recording data that would revolutionize understanding of spatial phenomena. Jack stared in awe at the beauty before him. This alone made everything worthwhile. But he couldn't stay. The ship's power reserves were draining, and he needed enough to make the return journey. With one last look at the nebula's heart, Jack turned the Phoenix around and began the journey back. The return was even more challenging. The energy patterns had shifted, creating new obstacles. Twice, the ship nearly spun out of control when unexpected surges hit, but Jack's instincts and the Phoenix's responsive design kept them moving forward. As he approached the edge of the nebula, Jack reactivated his communication system. Immediately, a chorus of voices filled his cockpit. "Signal. I got a signal. Is it the human? Impossible. No one could survive that long in the..." "Phoenix to control," Jack interrupted. "Preparing to exit nebula in approximately 3 minutes." Silence fell over the channel, then erupted in a buzz of shocked voices. Back in the observation dome, the gathered engineers and officials pressed against the windows. No one had expected to see the Phoenix again. Even Lori and Dex had begun to fear the worst as hours passed with no communication. Rex stood rigidly, his blue skin darker than usual with emotion. His own ship had been forced to retreat after suffering heavy damage, shields overwhelmed by the nebula's power. "There," someone shouted, pointing. A tiny speck of light appeared at the nebula's edge, growing larger as it approached. The Phoenix emerged from the swirling energy cloud, its hull glowing faintly with residual power, but otherwise intact. The observation dome erupted in cheers. Species that minutes before had dismissed human engineering now pointed and gestured excitedly. Jack guided his ship back to the test area, performing a simple landing maneuver. As the engines powered down, he sat for a moment in the cockpit, letting the reality sink in. He had not only survived the nebula, but had gone deeper than anyone in history, and he had the data to prove it. The entry hatch opened, and Jack climbed out to a crowd of alien engineers rushing toward him. Cameras and recording devices captured his emergence from the ship that had done the impossible. Lori pushed through the crowd and reached him first. "You did it," she cried, all 4 arms raised in celebration. Dex was right behind her. "You're not dead." "Impressive." Jack grinned. The Phoenix held together beautifully. "Better than I expected, actually." As the crowd pressed closer, asking questions and offering congratulations, Jack noticed Rex standing apart, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Their eyes met across the bay. The challenge wasn't over yet, but the real battle, for respect, was already won. The grand hall of the summit was packed beyond capacity. Engineers from every corner of the galaxy crowded inside to hear the results of the challenge. Rumors had spread rapidly about the Phoenix's journey through the Krell Nebula, growing more fantastic with each retelling. Jack sat in the front row beside Lori and Dex, trying to ignore the stares and whispers. His data from the nebula's core had been analyzed by the summit's scientific committee throughout the night. The findings were about to be announced. The Galactic Engineering Council's chairperson, a tall being with crystalline features, stepped onto the platform. The hall fell silent. Engineers and honored guests, the chairperson began, voice resonating through the hall. Today marks a historic occasion in our collective scientific endeavor. For the first time, we have comprehensive data from the heart of the Krell Nebula. Displays around the hall activated, showing the incredible images Jack had captured, the swirling energy patterns, the perfect sphere at the nebula's core, the readings that defied conventional understanding of spatial phenomena. The Phoenix, designed and piloted by human engineer Jack Miller, has achieved what many thought impossible. The chairperson turned toward Jack. "Would you please join me, Engineer Miller?" Jack walked to the platform, acutely aware of the thousands of alien eyes following his every move. As he stood beside the chairperson, he spotted Rek in the crowd, the Terrian's expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. "The Council has reviewed your data and methodology," the chairperson continued. "Your approach to navigating the nebula was unconventional by our standards. Perhaps you could explain your thinking to our gathered colleagues." Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Thank you. The key was not fighting against the nebula's energy, but working with it. On Earth, we have oceans with powerful currents. Early sailors learned that fighting these currents led to disaster, but understanding and using them allowed for successful voyages." He activated his own display, showing the Phoenix's design. "My ship was built not to resist the nebula's forces, but to channel and flow with them. Sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective." Murmurs spread through the hall. Jack continued, growing more confident. "The Phoenix incorporates principles found throughout nature on my planet. Birds that ride air currents, fish that navigate rapids, even the way plants bend rather than break in strong winds. These natural designs have been perfected over millions of years." A Terrian engineer stood up. "But your technology is so basic. How could it succeed where our advanced systems failed?" Jack smiled. "Sometimes we're so focused on adding more power, more shields, more technology, that we forget to ask whether we're solving the problem the right way. The Phoenix succeeded not because it was more powerful, but because it approached the challenge differently." The hall was silent as his words sank in. Then Lori stood up. "I helped repair the Phoenix after it was damaged," she announced. "What I saw wasn't primitive technology. It was elegant simplicity. We all have something to learn from this approach." Others began to stand. Engineers who had helped, who had witnessed the Phoenix's flight, who had seen the data. Even a few who had laughed the loudest before the challenge now nodded in respect. The chairperson raised a hand for silence. "In light of this achievement, the Galactic Engineering Council has two announcements. First, Engineer Miller will receive the summit's highest honor for innovation." Applause erupted through the hall. Jack felt his face flush with pride. "Second, we have unanimously voted to establish a new cooperative research initiative, bringing together engineers from all worlds, including Earth, to explore new approaches to our greatest challenges. Engineer Miller, would you lead this initiative?" Jack's heart raced. This was more than he had ever hoped for, a chance to work with the greatest minds in the galaxy, to share ideas and approaches, to learn and teach. He looked out at the crowd. Lori was beaming. Dex gave what might have been a thumbs up with his scaly hand. And near the back, even Rek offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "I would be honored," Jack said. As the hall erupted in applause once more, Jack thought about how far he had come from his small workshop on Earth. The Phoenix had opened a door not just through the nebula, but between worlds. The aliens who had mocked him now looked to him with respect, not because he had proven them wrong, but because he had shown them something new. That progress comes not from who has the most advanced technology, but from who has the courage to think differently. And that was a lesson worth crossing the stars to learn.